Welcome to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and I know I have not put out a build video in a while, but that should not suggest that I have not been working hard behind the scenes. For those of you that follow my social media, I recently posted that I was hired by Bandai to create the Bloody Wolf armor set for multiple launch events for their hit game, Elden Ring. Now, this armor was intense. It was extremely detailed, and on top of that, I had a 35-day deadline. That is not something that I'd normally recommend to anybody. Now, because of that, I knew that I could not do it all by myself, so I entrusted my buddy Ashen Warrior Props to help me out with some of the pieces. Ashen helped create the sword and the shield, the cloth skirt, the pants, and the shins, which allowed me to hyper-focus on all the details that I was going to need to put into the character from the waist up. Now, with a 35-day build turnaround, I was not able to film because that's 35 days, 10 to 12 hours a day. That's stressful enough as it is. But I did take a ton of progress photos, and that's because the client was very interested in seeing the build progress of this behind the scenes, and also to make sure that all the details were up to the quality that they requested. So what I would like to do is, if you're interested in this process and in what it takes to build a costume like this, I want to show those progress photos to you and then just kind of walk you through it. So to start, Ashen Warrior Props worked on the sword and the shield, and these two props needed to be done as soon as possible because the client actually wanted them ahead of schedule for some behind-the-scenes promotional work that they wanted to do. So he was tasked with that. He did a fantastic job. Both the sword and the shield were created out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and because of that, they were extremely lightweight. Now, he also sealed the shield with some leak seal, and what that did was that gave it some additional textures. It really gave it that wrought iron, hammered metal look. He did a fantastic job on these, and I just want to give a shout out to Ashen Warrior on those props. While he was working on that, I was already starting a couple of the pieces on my side. And the first one was the helmet itself. Now, this was the only piece that I got as a partial 3D from the client. Everything else was scratch made. And when I say a partial 3D, it's because the helmet itself was missing some of the details and it wasn't really scaled properly. When I say that, it's because FromSoft characters tend to have very small heads, but very large shoulders and chest to give them that heroic stance. The problem with that is a normal actor, when you're making a helmet like this, you got to factor in the head, the cover, the chainmail that's going to go on that, and then a partial wig. So there needs to be a lot of room on the interior for this helmet to fit properly. And because of that, I was able to take that 3D model and I printed it off on my Peopoly resin printer. From there, I could heat form with my heat gun some of these pieces before I glued it together. That way I could give it enough stretch from side to side that, it wouldn't interfere too much with the ears. And then front to back, I had to lengthen the back a little bit, and then that allowed me to have a partial wig attached to the back cowl. Now, the 3D file of the helmet itself didn't have all of the details, so it was missing the crest up here on the top and the brim that was here on the back. I created both of these out of PVC board, and then I hand sculpted epoxy sculpt on top of that. That way it would be as rigid as the resin helmet itself. I then also went in between all the runes and used a very fine bit on my Fordham rotary tool to have some additional texture because I knew that those were going to be darker places and I wanted them to hold the paint a little bit better than the rest of the helmet was going to be needed to. From there, I could take this blank with all my additional sculptures. I clayed it up here with a wall. That way when I'm rotocasting, the resin isn't spilling out. And then I was able to use some mold max from Smooth On to mold this helmet. Now, normally I like using Rebound 25, but because it is a resin print, I had to use the mold max and add some Thivex into it to thicken it up. Otherwise, the rebound doesn't cure properly. From there, I was able to make a fiberglass mother mold for it, and I was then able to use some Smooth On 65D to rotocast a resin helmet. Now, this was the very first one, and normally when it comes to the very first cast that comes out, they're not all that great. They have a lot of the excess buildup from things that are on here that it pulls off. Plus, it also allows me to look and see, all right, where I might have like air bubbles that are getting trapped. What should I look for as far as making sure all of these details come out just right? So after I did this test piece, I did the final version, and then the helmet itself was sanded, all the eye slits were cut, everything was cut out with my Fordham and my Dremel rotary tool, and it was then set aside ready for paint. From there I moved on to the chest armor, and the chest itself was, it was a difficult piece. There was a ton going on with it, but to start I always do a prototype, and luckily the model for this armor was my brother, and he lives not too far away, so he was able to come down. And the prototype itself takes about 15-20 minutes. It's literally me throwing foam on him as fast as I can in general shapes just to get my overall size. From there, I'll then take poster board to create my final templates. Those are then transferred onto some 6mm HD foam in multiple layers. And as you can see with this chest armor, there's a ton going on to it. Of course, you do have these rib sections that are around the abdomen that slowly work their way up. But if you notice around his ribs, that is a seamless transition on those pieces. And I achieve that by utilizing some foam underneath and then skinning that with some 1mm HD foam and using some Super 90 spray adhesive. All of the details that are on the chest piece were all individually hand cut. I had started by doing a trial because I was like, man, I could probably sculpt this with foam clay pretty quick. And it would have worked, but the foam clay, in my opinion, the details were just a little too soft. So the only way I could see of getting around that was to cut all of these pieces out individually. So like all the fur that's at the bottom section of this armor piece here, that is all individual pieces of 4mm and 2mm all glued together to give it that fur composition. All the chest detail that's around the clavicle area at the top of the armor, all of that is, again, individually cut to match the in-game armor. This took a long time, but it's one of those things that where, like, if I had done it any other way, it wouldn't have looked this good. I mean, even these sections here that wrap around the shoulders to his back, all of that, I mean, 90% of it's going to be covered up with the shoulder pads or with additional cloth and fiber, but I knew it had to be there. And that also goes for the very back of the armor. Even though his hair covers all of the back, all of these individual detail sections back here needed to be done. And it's because, again, as an artist, I know it needs to be done, but also this is an armor set for a company that I greatly respect. You know, Bandai is awesome. They make amazing games. I wanted to make this armor match their level of creativity and match their level of detail that they put into their work. So once the chest armor itself had all been completed, I could then move on to the shoulder pads. And because I had to scale up and scale out the size of the helmet, I also had to scale up the size of the shoulder pads. And that's because otherwise, it would have had kind of a bobblehead look, and I did not want that in this armor set. And I was adamant about making the armor on the upper section all very proportional. So my buddy Ashen once again created a base template for the shoulder pads based off what he thought they would be. He's about the same size as my brother. I then took that and drew out all the individual pieces to match the in-game art. That's 57 individual pieces per shoulder pad. Yes, again, doing foam clay and sculpting this probably would have been easier, but having those individual pieces really allows all those details to be intricate, allows them to be separate, so when I'm hand painting them, they all stand out on their own later on. The other part that I really liked about the shoulder pad, so all the details are there, all the details are on the top. The feathers that kind of fan out, I actually backed them with some thermoplastic to make sure that those feathers kept their shape. They aren't ever going to get distorted or fall down. And then after I had the thermoplastic glued after it was shaped, I then once again skinned that with some 1mm foam, and that worked out fantastic. Now, as far as functionality and form go, the way that the chest armor slides onto the actor is it's sealed on one side, and at the seam on the other side, I ended up using rare earth magnets. Now, in case anybody's wondering, yes, if you were to move too much, the rare earth magnets could pop. So, to alleviate that, I added a small parachute clip to the top and the bottom underneath the brim. That way, when I tested it with my brother, he could actually do some poses, do some moves, and the armor wasn't going to separate. It actually worked out perfect. For the shoulder pads, same thing. I used parachute clips to attach those to the chest armor. I had two different sections at the top that either one could click into based on the size of the actor. So if they get an actor down the road that's not my brother and it's somebody that's even bigger, they can actually change how those shoulder pads sit on the armor to function with that new actor. And parachute clips, that's a big thing that I've learned over the years as far as how all of this needs to go together. I had used Velcro very early on, had numerous problems with it. Parachute clips, once they clip in, it's nice, it's quick, it's not going to go anywhere, because when everybody's on set waiting for you to get the costume on, it's very important that you make it go on and come off as quickly as possible, because they've got photographers, they have the actual stage or set that they're utilizing, they have all the other actors that may be there. So the ability to get the costume on, get it off, extremely important. Now the bicep armor is made the exact same way. It's made out of HD foam with 4mm strips and then 2mm very thin strips all around those to give it that layered look. That also attaches to the chest armor using a parachute clip and 1-inch nylon strapping. It's also adjustable, so this armor can fit anyone from 6 foot to about 6'5". Everything on the upper body is all adjustable for any actor that is not my brother. Moving on from there, I started working on the metal skirt, and this piece itself was all handmade. I started off with some PVC board, and then I hand sculpted all of the details using monster clay. I could then take that piece and I could mold it using some Rebound 25, and I cast this 30 times out of resin to make up the entire skirt. Now, if you notice, there are small rings on the back of all those pieces. That will allow those rings to attach to the cloth that will wrap around that front section. Basically, what it does is it makes all of those individual pieces hang properly. They'll actually swing a little bit, but it gives it a weight that when the actor is moving and they're all moving, it looks really good. For the gauntlets were actually one of the most difficult parts of this entire costume, because not only were they insanely detailed, but they all needed to fit within each other and be somewhat movable so that the actor would have the ability to move his arms, move his wrists, and move his hands. My idea was to create the actual template for the design of the gauntlets in ZBrush. So I modeled this, and if you notice, I modeled it flat. Made a flat mold of 2 of those, and then I was able to resin cast this. And again, I used 65D to resin cast these, and the reason I did that is that while it isn't completely set up, I would pull them out of the mold, wrap them around a PVC pipe, and Velcro those into place to get that curve to them. I could then take my heat gun, add additional heat, and manipulate them and push them in further until they actually kind of like layered on top of each other. The big thing that these pieces that all went into each other needed to do was attach to the leather gloves. And I did that using 3 different types of adhesives. I would use E6000, I used barge, and I used super glue. And it's because each one of these different types of adhesives would have its own property that I needed. The E6000 and the barge have a little bit of give. So in sections where it needed to flex a little bit more, like on the top of the forearms, that's where I would add those. Super glue was then used on the underside where it needed to be a little more rigid. And for all of the finger details, all of those are individually cut out of PVC board and one by one glued onto the gloves. Constantly testing them just to make sure that the flexibility in the fingers and the joints was going to be all good, because again, my brother had to hold a shield and a sword. He had to have that flexibility, no issues with not being able to close the hand all the way and having to put additional wrapping around a handle. I mean, that wouldn't look good. And I added some additional armor also to the interior, the top of the glove, that went up to about the elbow to match in game. The thing that's really difficult when you're taking a video game and you're making it in the real world, video games have clipping. So like there was a picture that they had sent me of his armor where he's got the sword like over on his shoulder, and I zoomed in on it, and like the elbow armor is not even there. It's clipped out. All of the armor on the forearm is there and on the armor on the bicep, but it just clips into nothing. So when we're thinking that as a costumer, you have to think about, all right, how is this going to function for a real person to be able to utilize that? So it's a lot of engineering, a lot of trial and error, a lot of challenge. But those are the things that I really enjoy when putting a costume like this together. Moving on to the lower half of the costume, Ashen Warrior Props, again, my buddy William, he made all of the cloth skirt that went over top of the metal skirt that I'd made. He did the pants as well, which are cloth, and then he actually did actual leather squares and hand riveted all of those. I can't remember how many he said he did, but it was a lot. And then he also worked on the shin armor, which is also very, very detailed. All those pieces that are on the shin armor are also individually cut and then adhered to it. The way the shin armor works as to going on to the actor, the back half of the calf is also magnetic, very big, large magnets that are underneath of the foam that will clip that on. For the knee section, he actually sent all of that to me before they went out, and I was able to add the same small parachute clips that I had done on the chest armor onto those. Again, the whole thing is all the straps, all this armor goes on as fast as possible. So at this point, almost everything is fabricated, but now it's time to prime and paint. And to do that, for the HD foam sections, of course, I used the Plasti Dip. I made sure that I put the can in hot water before I sprayed it on to give it a nice smooth surface. And I made sure that the shop was at an optimal temperature because at the time, it was freezing in the Midwest and I could not paint anything outside. For the resin cast pieces, I used some Krylon flat black primer on those just to prime them, get them all ready for their base coat. For the base coats, I use Rust-Oleum Antique Flat Nickel. And again, when I'm applying the spray paints to the foam or any of the resin cast pieces, I'm not applying it thick. I'm doing a light coat on there because most of the detail is all going to be done hand painting with the acrylics later on. So after I do a light dusting of the metallic antique nickel on everything, I then took some graphite powder and I started to buff the surface of all the resin pieces, all the foam pieces. What that did is it fills in all the foam pores if there are any, and then I could buff it to get a metallic sheen. From there, I then used some Krylon Crystal Clear to seal all of that because the graphite powder can come off. Now that does dull the powder some, but you now have a great surface that has been prepped for acrylics. So I then took Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver and I started to hand paint the metallic details onto the chest, onto the arms, onto the helmet, everything that needed that metallic sheen. I then did a black wash on all these pieces to make sure that that got down into all the nooks and crannies, all the crevices, just to make sure that the armor had that dirty, grungy look to it. One thing that Bandai had really stressed was that they were very adamant on everything having a metallic sheen, but they wanted it dark and grungy to match the atmosphere of their games, and I was up for that challenge. After the black wash had been complete, I can then go back in with more iridescent rich silver to then bring out all of the highlights. The main thing that I really want to do on this is give the armor an overall light value, okay? So what I'm talking about there is when I paint the helmet, I'm gonna add iridescent bright silver also up here and some additional graphite powder that I'm not going to add at the lower section. So when I have lights above that are in the studio or in natural lighting, it's going to appear brighter here and kind of transition to a darker value. It just gives the armor more of an overall contrast. When it came to the chest armor itself, if you notice, there's lots of different hues going on in there. Some of it has kind of a goldish hue, some of it has a rosy hue to it. The Bloody Wolf armor on the biceps and on the lower abdomen has this kind of like rosy tint to it. And Utrecht brand Russet Metallic seemed to be the best thing that I could find. It's a little thinner paint, which worked great because I was able to mix that with some of the iridescent rich silver and really have this beautiful transition from the silver that's up around the collared areas down into the pecs and into the abdomen. So this part, all the metallic armor on my end has been painted, and this is when I receive a box of goodies from Ashen Warrior Props that contains the cloth skirt, the pants, and the shins. Now, he didn't paint the shins all the way because he knew that I was going to try to match it to the rest of the armor. So what he did was he gave it a base, like I do in a lot of my build videos, and then he gave it to me to paint it to match the rest of the armor. Now at this point, this is also when I did the strapping. I added the parachute clips to those, and then I added that russet metallic that I had used on his chest, also on the knees to really make those pop. He had also included some leather straps that he had made because, of course, if it's going to be a fantasy character, they just need a ton of belts all over them for no reason that don't necessarily even go anywhere. But I now have all of these straps, and so I have to figure out exactly how they're going to go on the costume and if any of them need to be changed. Most of them were all good. The only thing I really changed was the strap that went up and around the shoulder. I cut the strap in the back and I added about 6 inches of elastic in the middle there. And what that did was allow the actor to be able to flex and move more where that leather wouldn't give that elastic wood. But that's the kind of thing you want to think about with a costume like this. You want to think about what needs to give versus what needs to be extremely rigid. If I'm going to have a strap that's extremely rigid, but it needs to give some, that's a perfect way to do it. Just add some elastic in between, and then on the backside, his hair covers all of it anyway, so you never even see it. It's just part of the functional costume. Now, as far as the other accessories that go around his belt, I have a couple pouches and I have a war horn. The war horn is an actual horn that I was able to purchase online, and then I etched it with my rotary tool to match in-game all the designs that are on it. The additional pouches that are on there I got off Amazon. They were originally black, but I was able to kind of strip them some and repaint them, and they turned out great for this purpose. That's another thing where if you're on a deadline like this and you've got to get something done in X amount of days, don't build everything. You know, if you can find things that you can manipulate on your own, that you can take part of it even and use that into the build, do that. By all means, do that. That also comes down to the boots that he wears. So the boots were purchased online as well. Again, I didn't need to make them. They only come up to about his ankle. They are not full height boots, and it's because it's not necessary. Again, the shins are magnetic. If you add additional boot material in underneath that, it may not fit properly. The big thing I'd say there is if you are making a costume or doing cosplay, you're on a crunch, look and see what you can buy that you can at least manipulate and make it work for your costume versus you making everything yourself. With the armor all complete, this is the only other thing that I really put off was the wig, and I knew that I couldn't do a full wig under the helmet. I just did not have the room for that. And so I was like wrestling with it in my head for days, like how do I get the wig to work? And luckily, the way I figured it out, the brim comes down enough and I was able to carve enough out of the inside of the helmet that I attached the wig to the chainmail cowl. Most of the wig attaches to the cowl that's already on the head, then the helmet just comes down. There are a few strands of additional hair that start about midway here and then move to the back, and that just covers like a transitional seam. Additional hair that I had from the second wig, I then used in the back of the crest on the top of the helmet, and on the back of the armor, he actually has fur coming out of his armor and is able to utilize that in those areas. So I think all the fur applications on this turned out really well. So at this point, the entire armor set is all put together, and honestly, I'm really happy with how everything looks. I get it in the box and it goes off to California. So at that point, we are in California, and again, we are attending multiple events for Bandai showcasing this costume. We went to a couple different studios, that sort of thing. But our first event was the launch premiere at GameStop, and they did a fantastic job there. They actually had a different team come in, and they made a full like Elden Ring display specifically for this, where my brother could be in there. Other customers could come around and have pictures with him. I mean, there were hundreds of people there picking up the games, and it was a great way for them not to just stand around and have to do nothing. They could interact with the costume, they could come up and take a look at it, and everybody really, really liked it. And then some of the Bandai executives came in a little later on, and they were able to look at the whole display and the costume and everything. So it was a really cool experience. Again, it's one of those things where working on it for that long, like I look at it, I still see flaws in my mind being the artist, but having someone that has worked on this game for years come in and take a look at it, I mean, they were blown away with the level of detail, especially again in the time frame that I was allowed to do this. And that's the big takeaways from any of these types of jobs. As long as the client is happy, as long as the costume doesn't fall apart, that's what matters. It doesn't matter all the nights that I stressed out about this. It doesn't matter about all the times that I didn't eat lunch because I was out here nonstop. At that point, when the fans get to look at it and their eyes light up and they see like how awesome it is and they run over because they want to ask for pics, I mean, that is what really, being a costumer, being a prop builder, that's where it hits me, is that I enjoy that interaction with people that maybe don't do this every day, but they get to see something like that and it blows their minds. Now, a few of the other things that we did out in California are still under NDA, so I can't talk about them yet, but hopefully I can soon and share those on my social media. And if you don't follow my social media, be sure to follow me along at Twitter and Instagram at SKSProps. After this build, I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty burnt out. I didn't want to build anything for a couple of weeks. And I took that time and I actually played Elden Ring, and I beat Elden Ring. And it's a fantastic game. So if you want to check that out, definitely do that. And I'll hopefully have some new build videos soon.